We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is the Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cooke and Jacci Jones.
Yeah. Welcome back to the next episode of the Therapy Show Behind Closed Doors with the wonderful Mr. Bob Cooke and myself, Jacci Jones. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at working with multiples, a model for effective treatment. Explain what that's all about.
I will explain that. So in 1989, 1990, 91, 92, 93, 94, seems a lifetime ago, I specialised in working with multiple personality disorder. Okay, that diagnosis in the DSM-4/5 changed to dissociative identity disorder, personality disorder. So when people talk about dissociative identity disorder, at the extreme end, they talk about multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
Names simply changed. If we look at dissociative identity disorder, less personality disorder, that's one end. But if we think about this as a continuum, on the extreme left, we have daydreaming, which is part of dissociation.
Yeah.
Now, as we go up the continuum, we get to more, from milder aspects of dissociative identity disorder to more fixed aspects of dissociative identity disorder, right up to the top where we lose time and we act out as different people.
Yeah.
So the whole continuum. And it will be, because dissociation is a natural defense system against trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
And the more trauma we have, the more we may create multiple parts of ourselves or fragment parts of ourselves as a coping mechanism. So there's a continuous health, really, in relation to level of trauma. Back when I early trained in the mid-80s, I then met Richard Erskine, a trainer and therapist from the United States, who now lives in Canada, by the way. And he taught a lot about how to work with multiple personality disorder. And I trained and I learned, and I worked with quite a lot of people with multiple personality disorder in the 90s. I'm not sure why it changed its name to dissociative identity disorder. I think it's changed its name to encompass the continuum rather than just call it, one singular term, multiple personality disorder. If that all makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why. I don't know whether shock's the right word or not, but quite shocked at the beginning of the continuum is just daydreaming, which we all do to a certain extent.
Yeah. But if you take the definition of dissociation.
Yeah.
So everybody listening, therapists, clients or counsellors, will probably know what the word dissociation means. So I'm going to define it.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that anyway. Dissociation means, the term means movement away from the self. We dissociate, we move away from our thinking, in the feeling and behaving in the moment.
Yeah.
Now we do that momentally, don't we?
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
daydream.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's why I put it at that end.
Yeah.
When I was 8 years of age, which is 67 years ago or something, I lived in Acos Green in Solihull. And I bicycled probably about 5 miles, though it seemed like 15 miles, every day from Acos Green to Alton to Solihull to Knoll, where my school was. Half of the time, I would say, half those journeys I did over the last 6 years, I don't know how I got there.
Yeah.
Because I was
can
somewhere
relate
else.
to that. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so we have different levels of fragmentation of the self and different levels of disavowal of the self according to the traumatic events that we've been caught up with in our lives. So that's what I'm saying. At the neurotic sense, we just have mild daydreaming, which is that end. And then right at the other end is the fragmentation to separate entities of the self to cope with the extreme trauma and is more fixed.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I love the fact that as human beings, we're so clever at adapting to protect ourselves,
Yeah.
doing
Oh, it's a
things like that.
wonderful mechanism
Yeah,
to move away from the self, so we don't have to think, feel, uh, you know, in terms of the trauma that's happening to us.
yeah,
So abuse,
yes,
sexual abuse, severe emotional abuse, or, the more we fragment
yeah,
or we dissociate, so we don't have to feel what's happening to us. I remember when I started to train again a long time ago and working with sexual abuse survivors, and I remember working clinically with them. I remember first one of them, and this is way back in my memory, when they were talking about their abuse, and I said, "Okay, how did you handle that or cope with it?" I can't remember my words. And they said, "Oh," and they used the word dissociate. I dissociated and put myself on the ceiling, and I could look down at what was happening to me, and I didn't feel anything because I was another person,
uh,
or I was myself as another person looking down at myself. What a fantastic, fantastic defense system.
absolutely.
There's a cost to it,
Yeah, I can imagine.
of
Yeah,
course, because we've started to fragment our
yeah,
personality structure. And that has consequences in terms of being in, wholly in the here and now and having a level of spontaneity.
yeah.
Every time we disavow ourselves or fragment ourselves, we are, moving away from a holistic, integrated personality structure to a much more fragmented one where we may lose sense of parts of ourselves.
Would we know that a person has this when they come into the therapy room?
Well, if we look at multiple personality disorder, before I go on to dissociative identity disorder, I mean, okay, remember the name changed to dissociative identity disorder. And I think that I didn't talk to the person who written, the thinking behind it all, but I think they wanted to encompass a continuum of dissociation.
Yeah,
Wasn't there in the description of multiples. Um, but when I started to work consciously with people with, um, you know, real discrete entities of different parts of themselves, or in fact, yeah, let's say different parts of themselves. No, they wouldn't come in and say, I suffer from multiple personality disorder, but they would come in and talk about heavy trauma. So there would be people who have experienced high series of traumatic events, usually abuse.
yeah,
And they will then have started to fragment and create different personalities. It's a process, not an event, remember. They will start to fragment and move away from themselves and to deal with the ongoing trauma, create different personalities or parts of the self to carry the trauma or to function, to be able to function. So, no, they don't come and say I'm a multiple, but they talk about heavy trauma and they will talk about how they cope with that.
would we see a certain behavior from them?
Yeah, people who, yeah, I'll go through some of them. People who have created different parts of the personality. I'm not talking about sub-personalities, I'm talking about actual entities. They'll lose time.
Okay,
Yeah, so they might say, you might be talking with the person, they might say, oh, um, well, actually, I'm not quite sure what I did yesterday. Um, and if you get a real um, red flag when somebody comes and says, I just want to talk to you about how I found myself going to Birmingham the other day, and I don't really remember how getting on the train.
wow,
Was there the personality got on the train?
yeah,
So amnesia, losing time is very common to the creation of different personality structures. Yeah,
yeah,
that's all. I used to think I used to, you know, how can I explain this? I used to know what personality the person was in quite often by what they were wearing.
Right. Yeah.
If they were Kelly, say, instead of Patrick, then they would wear different things.
Yeah. Like
And
sometimes they might wear muted colours, whereas other times they'd have
yeah,
vibrant, bright colours
yeah,
and be a bit more
absolutely.
exuberant. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember one of people I'm thinking about, she talked about having 120 different pairs of shoes
Wow.
with different colors and styles and different things. And she'd about 20 odd personalities. So yeah, and often talk differently. So their tone of voice would be different. Handwriting would be extraordinarily different. And also you have different, okay, let's use the language. I'm really talking about multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the alter or the person that's come to you for therapy that's functioning, let's call them Mary, would be called the host alter,
Yes.
because they're talking to you in present time. Yeah. Let's just say for simplicity, there's 8 other parts of the cell, 8 other personalities. They would be called alters.
Right.
So in the therapy, you're not going to immediately know those 8.
No.
You might start experiencing 2 or 3 different parts, let's say parts of the self. It's not quite like parts work, like the new language of today, but and these personalities would start emerging. So Mary comes in during the work, there's a complete change. So you can start seeing or experiencing you're actually not talking to Mary, you're talking to somebody else. And then you might say, is there somebody else here with us? And Mary might say, this doesn't happen in the first session.
No. No. Yeah.
Way down the line, I'd like to introduce you to Teresa. And Teresa is a bit older than me. Sometimes she comes with me to the therapy room. And then I might say back, oh, okay, it's okay for Teresa to come in. And then I started talking to them, a bit like couples therapy.
Yeah.
Then down the line, when we're talking about different other types of trauma or rape or whatever it is, we might find another protector coming in, which we still can call alters if you like. But these alters emerge through Mary, which is the host alter. And then you talk to the others through Mary.
Yeah.
And the first thing you would do is start putting a sort of mind map together of all the different types of alters. And you get younger alters that may appear at the time of the early trauma. Then you might get protector alters. And then so you have different types of alters, and you draw out a map. So for sake of this podcast, say there's 6 of them or 7 of them.
Yeah.
And they would correspond usually, or the emergence of them would correspond with the time of the trauma. So you might get younger if alters which were created really early on in the early traumas, and then as the traumas, it might get older, and you might have a distinct alter which has a distinct protector role, or you might have a alter which we want to call the XX alter, and they're created to protect the person from the trauma. But when they are, or when the other alters emerge, which are parts of themselves, they are different, discrete people. Usually, as I said, different languages, different tone of voice, acting perhaps in a different way than Mary would act. You would think, so one is to get a map of all the different alters, and then through Mary to start getting conversation, different alters, because some of the alters might never even knew that other alters existed.
It's fascinating, isn't it, Bob?
And in the end, you're moving towards integration. I'm not talking about healing of the trauma. I'm talking about integration of the self. And the first step is that they start talking to each other.
Yeah.
It's not about saying goodbye to these alters, because you'd be in continual grief then, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
It's about
absolutely.
helping
Yeah.
the person understand the different parts of the self, their switches, their knowing when X has arrived and B has gone out, and helping them talk to each other so they can function in a cooperative way rather than a fragmented, conflictual way, or a way where they didn't even know the other person was coming in and out. So cure might be integration.
Yeah.
So that's work with multiples. That might be the cure. You know, there are some books, if you're really interested, there's a book called Multiple Personality Disorder by Kluft, Kluft. There's no, which talks about the different, what I'm talking about, and also saying goodbye to different parts of yourself. But I think that's often too difficult for the person in terms of grief, and they could end up hospitalized as an overwhelmed with grief. So I saw therapy very much around I'm helping them knowing about all the different alters, and a sense of being able to talk with each other and cooperate with each other instead of being hostile and conflictual with each other, and the understanding when some people were in and some were out, understanding how it fits into the system. Are you with me? And I
Yeah.
saw that
Yeah. Yeah.
saw that as cure.
Yeah.
More likely a 10-year treatment, 7 to 10 year treatment. So they could get to a place of understanding not only why all these personalities were formed, but understanding when they're coming, going out, and the function, and be able to talk to them, and then they can mediate in their head and have a sort of cooperative meeting and coming up with a healthy functioning system, rather than being in the dark to
Yeah.
the conflictual patterns that go on.
I would imagine it's quite comforting for some people that have been through really, massive trauma to think or imagine or perceive that they're not on their own, that they do have other people around them all the time.
Yeah,
When people talk about multiple personalities, I always think about that film Sybil.
yeah. Sybil was loads and loads and loads and loads and loads and
Yeah,
loads of alters, and you had many films. One that came out, one was called Split, and different things. In the end, I was a group psychotherapist. That really helped me, because really I'm helping facilitating a healthy group process.
yeah. What a lovely way of looking at it.
So there could be more harmonization between different parts of the self.
Yeah,
So it could function in a more sense of harmony rather than destruction. So I
yeah,
did love training around that and work with people for 10, 11, 12 years towards that system. Nowadays, you have this word, dissocial identity disorder, which has taken place of multiple personality disorder. And I think of that as the continuum, as I've just said. Most people who come in will be in different parts of the continuum. And according to the levels of trauma and how they live their life out, we would then put them in, in the continuum somewhere. And
yeah,
then contracting around that. So
yeah,
TA, if you think about it in TA terms and think about ego states, the way that TA therapists think of ego states and parts of the self, then the way I'm talking, perhaps, how can I explain? The framework of TA, I think, helps understanding some of the split off systems of personality disorders, multiple
yeah,
personalities. But really, if you train as a group therapist, it really helps, because that's where you're aiming at the end of the day, to see this process as group therapy amongst all these different alters. Takes a long time to deal with all this.
yeah. And getting to know each part of the personality, and like you say, when they appear, looking for changes in the way that they speak or sit or the demeanor or whatever it is. I would imagine it's really, really interesting work, but
Well, if
exhausting at the same time.
you get to the severe end or the intense end of what's called dissociative identity disorder in 2024, I can't remember when he's changed his name, then we're working the same way. We're
Yeah,
working different fragmentations and personalities created by the self to deal with extreme intense trauma. Often, some people would say there's a level of psychosis in all that lot. I mean, we have different languages, but I think that there's a highly protective function by fragmenting it off different parts of the self and creating different personalities, if you like, to deal with trauma so we can actually function. But I said there's a high cost to it.
Yes.
Because if you're repeatedly traumatized in a way which includes repetitive abuse, for example, then we may appear psychotic to cope with the trauma. And some people, if you think about it, find that repetitive being raped or whatever it is so unimaginably traumatic to deal with, they then, they may create all those different parts of the cells, but they can be diagnosed as psychotic, and then you've got a completely different process going on about being sectioned and everything else. So there's a whole podcast in itself, but that's what I used to do all those years ago. And multiple chair techniques, if you want to put it there, because you've got all these different parts of the self, they might have multiple chairs. But I believe you can do therapy with people suffering from intense DID, if you think about it as helping them cooperate and function in a healthy way with different parts of themselves and get an understanding of those different parts of themselves and work towards a cooperative, harmonizing process rather than a destructive, conflictual process.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of that because, like I say, it's a wonderful thing that we can do as human beings as a protection from ourselves. It's, I want to say to honor that process rather than try to obliterate it or take it away from the person.
Oh, I think they'll end up in hospital because they'll be so overwhelmed with grief.
Yeah.
It's too much.
Yeah.
As the people we're talking about usually have been so traumatized, have tried so many suicide attempts, have been so overwhelmed, usually been tortured, that that was their only way of dealing with all this, is to create another personality so they don't have to deal with the pain and suffering that they are being, put through, really. So we can see how a person has devised this system. And I go back to you really at the beginning. What a wonderful system, a very creative way of attempting to deal with the most unimaginable of situations.
Yeah.
All the people that have been, like, you think of, is it something West? He was one of the biggest serial killers in UK history, Billy West or whatever his name.
Fred West.
Fred West.
Yeah.
These serial killers of that amount. I bet if you went to, is it Fred West's house where they found a few of those people being abused, if you found them, probably people going there might have called them psychotic because they created different parts of the self to deal with the torture. So I know people have different languages, but multiple personality disorders are fragmentation of the self, creating different personalities to deal with what is often so unimaginable we can't think of.
Yeah. And like you said, the process of treatment kind of splinters off. If you're talking about psychosis and psychotic compared to this, that maybe isn't always helpful for the person.
A word of caution in the podcast. Okay. To work with this population, you need to be very experienced.
Yeah.
I've been a CTA clinician working, I don't know, 7 or 8 years before 9 years before I started training in these areas, for example. And I can't think of when I started working with what I call a person with multiple personalities to the level I'm talking about this. But I bet it was 10 years on, and quite 2 or 3 years of working as in this area, and at least 9 years working as a group psychotherapist.
Yeah.
I took things very gradually and learned very gradually, but it isn't something you start. You may need to have experience. That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
This
Yeah.
podcast. I'm talking about experienced therapists, trained therapists, to be able to even have the skills working in this sort of area.
Yeah. I love the way that you connected the group therapy with it. I quite like the idea of that it is just working with a group of people. They're just all inside the one host, if that makes sense. But it is still group therapy. Yeah.
Yeah,
What
because
a lovely way of looking at it.
we have a lot of different parts of cells conflicting for time.
Yeah.
Lots of fragmentations, lots of amnesia, lots of not knowing if the other person exists, and a lot of fighting and a lot of competing for space, all those sorts of things. So as a group therapist who's been trained to deal with all these factions, different people,
Yeah.
it was easier for me.
That's lovely, Bob. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too, I don't know what the word is, deep for people listening. I think that's the wrong word, but it does take a lot of training to do this, and it is quite complex. Oh, that's right. I was really meant, I hope it's not too complex the way I've been describing some of this, because it's not easy to describe it in some ways.
No, I think you've described it wonderfully. You've made it, for me, the thought, not that I ever would because I haven't had the training, but working with somebody with multiple personalities is a really scary thing. But when you said that it's like having group therapy, it takes away all that overthinking about it, if that makes sense.
That's how I saw it, and my group skills really helped as a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah. You're very good at your job, Bob. You've done an awful lot of things.
I've done a lot of this, and it took a lot of experience to work with this type of clientele. And I wouldn't want people listening to this podcast to just think they have the skills particularly to work in that area, even if they wanted to, because the other thing about this, I know this podcast will not be going on, perhaps we need 2 or 3 podcasts on this, is the counter-transference for a therapist dealing with people have been so traumatized, so tortured, so hurt, so repetitively assaulted. It's no picnic.
No, and I would imagine that do you know what I mean? As a person in private practice, it's not an ideal situation to be in if you're working with, the NHS or some sort of thing where there's, you've got your own security network around you. It would be more advisable.
Oh yeah, when I work with these people, I have endless supervision.
Yeah.
I think I used to spend all the money I earned on supervision.
I
But what
could
a
believe
wonderful learning experience.
Absolutely.
And I know I help these people.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of money on therapy because it's no picnic to listen to all that.
No, but like you say, looking at it from a therapeutic point of view, what a wonderful experience that you must. Yeah.
I learned so much from them, and I only, have the soothing thoughts that I think I helped as much as I could in that sort of world of integration as being the major cure.
I'm sure you did, Bob.
Oh.
So until next time, we're going to be looking at things to consider when working with a client with ADHD.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. So look forward to talking about that, and I'll see you then.
Yes, okie dokie. Take care, Bob.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.